So, good afternoon, everybody. So, it's a great pleasure and real honor to introduce the speaker of today for the last seminar of the physics department for this year, Jean Dalibard. He doesn't really need an introduction. So, you know that he is an expert of quantum electrodynamics and its frontiers with statistical physics, and most notably has worked on how an atom interacts with a laser field, statistical physics methods, then giving rise to laser cooling methods. He's the father of the magneto-optical trap, has then worked on various subjects also related to vortices in Bose-Einstein condensates. He started his career as a chargé de recherche CNRS, I think, at that time Laboratoire de Spectroscopie Hertzienne, which I think is now more or less the LKB of the École Normale Supérieure. He got elected at the Académie des Sciences in 2003, titulaire of the chair of atoms and photons in 2012 at the Collège de France. Médaille d'or, gold medal of CNRS last week in a very moving ceremony. And of course, he's also very, very well known here in these walls. So I think, Jean, you started your maître de conférence in the physics department of École Polytechnique in 1989.
Yeah.
And then you became a professor in 2003. And unfortunately, when you installed yourself in your group at Collège de France, you decided not to prolongate your contract in 2016. So I went through the archives of the physics department, and I found that it's very nice since there's always these prolongations of the contract. You have the letters of the people supporting this. So I would like to read from a report where in 2003, for your prolongation and appointment as a professor, our colleague Alain Aspect took up in himself a report of Gilbert Greenberg, where he said, un rapport honnête et raisonnable sur Jean Dalibard pourrait se résumer en un même mot prononcé de multiples fois à son sujet, aussi bien par des étudiants que par des prix Nobel. Exceptionnel. Ce qualificatif, il mérite autant par la perfection de son enseignement que par la richesse et la profondeur de ses travaux, en particulier sur le refroidissement radiatif, où il figure parmi les 4 ou 5 pionniers du domaine. Bon, évidemment, ça reste valable. Et je voudrais rajouter, cher Jean, que personnellement, ça me fait encore plus plaisir de t'accueillir aujourd'hui ici, parce que, comme tu sais, quand j'ai commencé mes enseignements à l'IX en 2003, très jeune enseignante, je l'ai fait dans ton cours, en enseignant les petites classes de mécanique quantique de tronc commun, et c'est là où on apprend le mieux à enseigner. So, thank you very much. Welcome to the physics department, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Silke. Of course, I didn't know about this letter. I'm really embarrassed that you found that. Okay. Well, thank you very much in any case for every kind word that you said. And thank you to all of you. Maybe I could remove this, yes, if you allow me. Okay. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's really a pleasure to be back in these walls after some years. As you said, I taught for 25 years at École Polytechnique, so I knew a little bit of these rooms after all this time, but it's always a pleasure to be back. So today I would like to speak about quantum matter, and quantum matter explored with our favorite tool, which is called atoms, cold atomic gases. So maybe to start, in order to define what I call quantum matter here, I can give two emblematic examples which are not from cold atom physics. The first one is superfluidity of liquid helium, which was discovered at the beginning of the 20th century. And the second one is superconductivity, which was discovered a bit later, but still in the first half of the 20th century. And in both cases, which are, as I said, emblematic of quantum matter, you have the two features of quantum matter which are present, which is the notion of a macroscopic quantum coherence, the fact that you can describe the system by a wave function, which is the same for all constituents. And also you have flow without friction. So for liquid helium, this is the fact that the liquid can flow through little holes without any dissipation. And for superconductivity, this is an electric flow of electrons, which can last forever, essentially, in the material. Quantum matter, as you probably all know, is essentially a low-temperature phenomenon. And the way to characterize the criterion about temperature is to say that the thermal wavelengths of the various constituents, so either the helium atom or the Cooper pairs that form the superconductor, this thermal wavelength has to be, oh, I just put it in the wrong way. Okay, has to be larger. Okay, let me correct that. Has to be larger than the interparticle distance. So you need a large double wavelength, therefore a small velocity, a low temperature. And since these two emblematic examples, there have been many other systems where macroscopic quantum features emerged. I have put here neutron stars, which is a very big one, and nuclear matter, which is a very small one. But in both cases, you can see some hints for superfluid behavior. Okay. So where are cold atomic gases in this framework? So here I have put a temperature scale, which spans something like -9 to +7 orders of magnitude. On this temperature scale, we on Earth are typically here, I mean, irrespective of the fact that we are either at the North Pole or on the equator. This is around here, a few hundred Kelvin. The surface of the sun is 6,000 Kelvin. The center of the sun is a bit more than 10 million Kelvin. Standard cryogenic tools are here. You start with liquid nitrogen at a bit below 100 Kelvin, and liquid helium brings you between 1 Kelvin, this is typical temperature of superfluidity, of the superfluid condition, down to millikelvin, say. And cold atoms on this scale are completely at the bottom. They are here. And essentially, everything I will discuss today is on the order, the temperature will be on the order of 10 nanokelvin here. So on this logarithmic scale, we in this room are much closer to the surface of the sun than to the cold atom physics. Okay, cold atoms are really exceptional in terms of temperature. And this means the fact that there are very low temperatures, this means that actually you can reach the criterion that the double wavelengths should be larger than the interparticle distance. You can reach this criterion with much lower density, since the double wavelengths for our atoms is much larger than the double wavelengths for helium atom in liquid helium, for example. It means that the interparticle distance can also be much larger. So we can deal with much more dilute system. We don't have to go to liquids. We can stay with gases. So I will not discuss how you cool atoms with light. I mean, this is now a technique which has been developed a lot in many laboratories over the last 40 years. So I will assume that we have cold atoms in the lab, like the one which are shown here, irradiated by lasers and trapped again with lasers. And so I would like now to illustrate what we can do with quantum matter. So there have been many different branches of research that have been developed with cold atom physics. So any talk is by definition very partial. And so I've chosen 4 instances where cold atom physics can bring something to the knowledge of quantum matter. The first one is about quantum coherence and permanent current that I would like to discuss briefly. Then I would like to turn to superfluidity and superfluidity even when Bose-Einstein condensation is absent. Quite often in textbook you read that there is a one-to-one correspondence between a superfluid behavior and Bose-Einstein condensation. I would like to explain that this is not always the case. You can have some superfluid systems which are not Bose-condensed, at least in the thermodynamic limit. And this is in particular the example of two-dimensional physics where the standard Bose-Einstein condensation transition is replaced by a more subtle transition discovered by Berezinski, Kosterlitz, and Thouless. Kosterlitz and Thouless got the Nobel Prize for that a few years ago. And finally, the last topic I would like to discuss is the notion of topological bands. And I would like to explain how topology can enter in the game and how, with cold atom, we can emulate systems which are known as to be topological, like the system exhibiting quantum Hall effect, integer quantum Hall effect. Okay, so before I start with these 3 items, let me present briefly a typical cold atom system that we are using in our lab. So here, this is a system which is aimed at studying 2-dimensional physics. So in order to have our atoms moving in a two-dimensional space, we have to freeze one direction, which is the vertical direction on this diagram. So what we do is we use these 2 laser beams, this one and this one, to make a standing wave here. This is called a one-dimensional optical lattice. And we put all our cold atoms inside the single node of the lattice, the single node of the standing wave. So this is what you see here. And if the intensity of the optical lattice is large enough, the frequency associated with the motion along the vertical dimension is large. Typically, in our experiment, this is 4 kilohertz. And our system will be 2-dimensional. That is, the motion along Z will be frozen if the 0-point motion associated with this omega Z, therefore this h bar omega Z over 2, is larger than the temperature kBT or the interaction energy. And this is indeed what we achieve. So assuming that this is valid in our experiment, the motion along Z is frozen, the atoms are in the ground state of the vertical motion, and they move essentially freely in the horizontal plane, the xy plane. So since we don't want the atom to escape at infinity, we have to confine their motion in the xy plane, and for this we use a digital mirror device, which is this system here, exactly the same system as the one which is in the video projector. We make an image on the digital mirror device. Here it's a star, and we shine a laser beam onto this device, and we make an image of the DMD, digital mirror device, onto the atomic plane here. So where you have a star, inside the star you have no light. Out of the star you have some light, and the atoms we choose the frequency of the light so that the atoms are repelled by the light. So the atoms move freely inside the star, but each time they hit the edge of the star, they see a wall essentially, and they bounce on this wall elastically and come back. So with that we can achieve the paradigm of textbook quantum mechanics of a particle in a box. So here we have a box, but the box is 2-dimensional and has the shape of a star. Of course, we have taken a star here, but we can take anything. And we can even make movies. That is, we can take a star and change the size of the star or transform the star into a disk if you want. So if you have any idea of experiments where it would be nice to change dynamically the shape of the confinement of the atoms, just tell us and we can discuss about it. Okay? So here I've put a few numbers about that. The number of atoms is typically between 10,000 up to 100,000. The density, as I said before, are much, much lower than what you have in liquid helium, for example, where in density between 10 and 100 atoms per micrometer square. And the temperature is, for what I will discuss essentially, on the order of 10 nanoK, but of course we can go higher in temperature if needed. For those of you who are not specialists of this field, the way we get this image of the atomic cloud is by absorption imaging. That is, we send along the vertical axis here a probe beam, which is resonant with the atoms. The atoms absorb photons in this probe beam. They make a shadow onto the probe beam, and we make an image of this shadow onto a camera. And this is how we get all our images. And this is a destructive image. That is, we have to, if we want to accumulate statistics on the behavior of the atom, as you will see in a moment, we have to do again and again the experiment, preparing always the atom in the same condition. Okay, so now I turn to the first topic I would like to describe, and this is about quantum coherence and permanent currents. So for this, this is an experiment that we did a few years ago, and the question we wanted to ask is the following. Let's assume that you have micro-condensates, that is a condensate here, another here, which have all a given phase, so phi 1, phi 2, phi 3, phi 4. And suppose that at a given time you establish some link here, here, between the various condensates. How will these condensates communicate with each other? Will they agree on a common phase? what is the final state of the system when you allow for communication between these various patches. This is a question which is relevant for transport experiment and also for the dynamics of a phase transition, because the phase transition usually, when you quench a system through a phase transition, for example, by cooling the system starts by forming small domains where you have a given value for the order parameter, but these various domains have various values for this order parameter, and later on, you have the so-called coarsening dynamics, where the various patches have to agree on a common order parameter. And this is what we wanted to address in this experiment. And maybe it's a good time to say that this experiment was performed by Monica Deutschberger, who was postdoc with us. It was a PhD thesis of Jean-Loup Ville and Raphaël Saint-Jalm. And I'm sharing the responsibility of this experiment together with Jérôme Beugnon and Sylvain Nassimben. So this is how we made the experiment. We used our digital mirror device to make a ring of atoms, but since we wanted to make several patches, several independent patches, this ring was cut in a certain number of pieces. So here you have a ring cut in 9 pieces, but we could vary the number of pieces between 3 and 12, I think, on this experiment. So at a given time, we remove the barrier. We do it in a short time. You will see in a moment why I call this short, 10 milliseconds. So we get this ring. And then we wait for the system to relax, to reach a steady state. So here I've put the same picture here and here, but actually it's a different picture. After 500 milliseconds, that I call a long time. Again, you will see in a moment why. And when we have this, we ask ourselves, is there a well-defined phase at any point in the ring? Here. And is this phase uniform, the same value everywhere, or does it have some winding? For example, may I have a phase which is 0 here, pi over 2 here, pi here, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. So phase winding of 2 pi, 0 and 2 pi being, of course, the same thing, since what counts for the phase is e to the I phi, so 0 and 2 pi are the same. So do we have a uniform phase or a gradient of phase? And when I say a gradient of phase, I mean actually a current, because as you all know, in quantum mechanics, a gradient of phase is related to a velocity. The velocity is h bar over m times the gradient of phase. So if I have a phase with a winding between 0 and 2 pi, it means that I have a current flowing actually clockwise in this system. And the phase winding is minus 2 pi. It's a current flowing the other way. And I can have a 4 pi, which is a current twice as big as the first one, and so on. Okay, so this is what we wanted to study. So a word about the time that I've put here. Why did I say that 10 milliseconds is short and 500 milliseconds is long? Well, you have to know the velocity of sound in the system, which gives the velocity scale in the annulus. The velocity of sound is typically 1.5 millimeter per second. The radius of the ring, it's written here, is about 20 micrometer, which means that the round trip for a phonon to travel around the ring is something like 80 milliseconds. So 10 milliseconds is short compared to a full round trip. So indeed, closing the barriers between the disk is such that there is no time to establish a full communication between various parts of the ring. But it is. But if I take now 500 milliseconds, this is long compared to a round trip. So how can we study the phase in this? So we are dealing with waves. And so a good way is to do interferences. I mean, this is how you can use wave in an intelligent way. So in order to do interferences, we did an experiment that an optician would call heterodyning. That is, we use a phase reference, and we make an interference of our system of study together with this reference. So the reference here is an inner ring, for which we have checked before that the phase is uniform in this inner ring. And we start with this. So we want to study the outer ring here made of 6 segments on this picture. We reconnect the outer ring. We let the system relax, as I discussed before. And then we want to interfere the inner ring and the outer ring. And for that, we remove simply the barrier in the xy plane. So we let the atom expand in the xy plane. The inner ring and the outer ring will interfere together. And what we see is the following. So depending on the realization of the experiment, as I said, we get different results, and we have to average then over these results. But here what you see is our single realization of the experiment. So for some shots, you get some concentric rings like this one, which means that there is no phase winding. This is a nice concentric ring, which means that indeed we had a a phase here which was well defined and which was uniform. So the interference between two disks with uniform phases give concentric rings. But from time to time, we can get some spirals. Here, spirals with a winding 1, which means that indeed we had something which was going from 0 to 2 pi rotating clockwise. But you can get more complex spiral with here m equal plus 3. If you follow carefully here, you will see 3 branches for these spirals, or spiral minus 3. So you see we have a nice tool to study the fact that we can generate some permanent currents, and we can study also the lifetime of these currents. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this study, which took us a long time, but let me just discuss a simple example to see how you can do things which are quantitative. Besides getting nice images, you can do something quantitative. Let's study the 3-segment case, which is the simplest one. So if I have a 3-segment case, I have 3 phases, which are drawn randomly when I cool the system, which are theta 1, theta 2, theta 3. I can always assume that theta 1 is 0 for simplicity by convention. And theta 2 and theta 3 are therefore random numbers which I can choose between minus pi and pi. And then I ask myself, for a given choice of theta 2 and theta 3, what should I get? And to put it in some minimization framework, what I want to minimize in the end is the kinetic energy of the system. The system is going to choose either no phase winding or a phase winding, which minimizes the kinetic energy. And in geometrical terms, it means what is the shortest path on the trigonometric circle to go from theta 1 to theta 2, theta 3 back to theta 1. This may look a bit mysterious, so let me make a drawing. Suppose I always put theta 1 at 0 here by convention. This is what I have written here. And I can have, for example, theta 2 here, something like pi over 2, and theta 3 like 2 pi over 3. Or I can have theta 1 equals 0 again, theta 2 equals 2 pi over 3, and theta 3 equals minus 2 pi over 3. And if I look at the shortest path on this trigonometric circle, you can see that here this corresponds to 2 different situations. In this case, in the first case, I will do theta 2, theta 3, and then if I want to go back to theta 1, the shortest path is here. And therefore, very likely the system then will choose to condense without any phase winding. Whereas if I'm in this situation here, I will go to theta 2, then to theta 3, and then the shortest path is here. And now I have a phase winding. So if this picture is correct, if I make a drawing here in the plane theta 2, theta 3 between minus pi and pi here, the possible values are inside the square. And you can easily find out that the gray zone here corresponds to the first case that I've drawn here. This case here, theta 2 positive, theta 3 negative, and around 2 pi over 3 here, minus 2 pi over 3 here, correspond to the lower triangle here. And the other situation, the symmetric situation, would correspond to this step. And so if this is correct, I can say immediately by comparing the area of this various zone that with a probability 3/4 I will be in the gray zone, no phase winding, and a probability 1/8 in this zone with a minus phase winding, minus 2 pi, and here plus 2 pi. And you do the experiment. You do the experiment with something like 240 shots, to 238 to be precise, and you see that the frequency of appearance of 0 phase winding is very close to 3/4 here, and the frequency of appearance of plus and minus 2 pi is indeed close to 1/8. So this means that this picture, simple geometric picture, is valid. So this was just an example of what can be done with this segmented ring. Again, I don't want to expand this too much because I want to discuss other topics, but as you can imagine, it's a good platform to study this non-equilibrium dynamics, varies the times that I've mentioned before. It's a closed many-body system, so it's interesting to see how a closed many-body system prepared out of equilibrium relaxes to equilibrium. In other terms, in this context, how long does it take to have a homogeneous phase appearing in the system? What you can do is to study the distribution of the winding numbers for n segments with n relatively large. We went up to 12. So for 3 segments, you could see how we can do it analytically. But for 12 segments, it's a so-called Euler-Frobenius law that we checked. Typically, the average winding number, I can write it. If I take the absolute value of the winding number, if I average, as you can imagine, it will scale like square root of n. But the prefactor here can be tested experimentally, and it works well. There had been before some experiments done with Josephson junction, and they did not confirm the square root of n law, so it was kind of an open question in the field, and so here we could confirm the square root of n law. And the last point I want to say that now that we know how to prepare a supercurrent in a probabilistic way, but at least we know that we prepare a supercurrent in 1/8 of the case and in rotating clockwise with the 3 segments, we can study its lifetime. And essentially, we found that the supercurrent had a lifetime which was simply limited by the atom loss. That is, it could live for 10 seconds, which was typically the lifetime of our atoms in the trap. OK. So this was the first topic I wanted to discuss to illustrate what we can do with our systems. The second topic is superfluidity. And superfluidity, even in the absence of Bose-Einstein condensation, I mean by that a system where we have Kosterlitz-Thouless transition. So for this, let me explain a bit why low-dimensional physics can be interesting. Historically, I think the first physicist to ask the question about what would happen in a low-dimensional world was Peierls. Peierls, around 1930, asked himself what would be the fate of usual objects of physics. By usual object, I mean magnets or crystals. What would be their fate if we were living not in a 3D world, but in a 2-dimensional world, taking into account thermal fluctuation or quantum fluctuation. And what Peierls showed is the following result. Let's assume that you are in a 2D world and that you have a crystal, here a square crystal. And you look at the thermal fluctuation of atom A, which is here, and you call UA the deviation with respect to the equilibrium position. Same thing for atom B here. And then you calculate, averaging over the thermal state of the system, you calculate the variance of UA minus UB. And what Peierls showed is that this variance increases indefinitely when you increase the distance between A and B. It's a slow increase, it's a logarithmic increase, but still it increases and tends to infinity. And this means, because this tends to infinity when the distance between A and B tends to infinity, this means that even if you know perfectly well where atom A is sitting here, if you take atom B sufficiently far apart, you have no information whatsoever where atom B is sitting within a lattice spacing. And therefore, you cannot have a long-range order in 2 dimensions. When you do the same calculation in 3D, then you find that this quantity tends to a finite value, which, when it is smaller than the lattice spacing, means that you have a true crystal. But in 2D, this quantity diverges. And to understand it in a simple term, it's just because in 2D, you don't have enough neighbors to constrain your position. It's even worse in 1D, actually. In 3D, you have plenty of neighbors, so moving an atom out of its equilibrium position costs a lot of frustration. And therefore, at least at low temperature, the atom prefer to stay in their place in the crystal. But in 2D, you don't have enough neighbors to maintain the stability of the crystal over long range. This result was generalized in the 60s by Mermin and Wagner on the one hand and Hohenberg on the other hand to any kind of phase transition which involves the breaking of a continuous symmetry. So if you take a crystal, the continuous symmetry is simply translational symmetry. And what Mermin, Wagner, and Hohenberg shows that such phase transition do not exist, at least at a non-zero temperature, and if the system has only short-range interaction, to be precise. So this was the situation in the 60s. And an example of system for which the Mermin-Wagner theorem applies is the 2-dimensional Bose gas. Bose-Einstein condensation is the breaking of a continuous symmetry. The symmetry is the U1 symmetry, the phase of the wave function. And condensing a gas, in the sense of Bose-Einstein condensation, means picking up a phase which is random between 0 and 2 pi. This is what we saw in the first part. And therefore, because of Mermin-Wagner theorem, Bose-Einstein condensation cannot occur in 1D or 2D because of the increased role of thermal fluctuation. And this you can see by looking at the one-body correlation function, the one which gives you the phase of the possible phase of the wave function. If you look at the value of the psi-dagger r psi of 0, the so-called function G1, this function has to tend to 0 when r tends to infinity, when the temperature is non-zero. So you have no long-range order in a two-dimensional sample or in a one-dimensional sample because of this. However, Kosterlitz and Thouless showed that still a transition to a superfluid state is possible in 2D at a non-zero temperature. And the key ingredient in the Kosterlitz-Thouless theory is topological defects, vortices. So let me explain this a little bit. The transition that Kosterlitz and Thouless have found is a transition between two disordered states, because we have just said that because of Mermin-Wagner theorem, you cannot have a true order. So it's a transition between two disordered states, but at high temperature, the disorder is very large, whereas at low temperature, the disorder is smaller. What do I mean by that? Well, the way to characterize the disorder is the way G1, the one-body correlation function, decays to 0. We know that it has to decay to 0, but it does not always decay to 0 in the same way. At large temperature, it decays to 0 exponentially, like this, whereas below some critical temperature, it decays to 0 only algebraically, like 1 over r to the power alpha. And what Kosterlitz and Thouless understood is, as I said before, the microscopic origin of this transition, which is vortices. Vortices, a vortex in this context, simply a place where the wave function of the system is 0 at this place and has some phase winding, plus 2 pi or minus 2 pi, around this 0. And the vortices are always present in the system. You should think of this system as a stochastic field, a field which is oscillating, and vortices are always present as possible thermal excitation of this field. But at low temperature, vortices are present only under the form of bound pairs of vortices, one vortex rotating clockwise and the other vortex rotating anticlockwise. So when these vortices are bound, say the red one is clockwise and the blue one is anticlockwise, here I have a system where the total phase winding around it is 0. And such systems do not destroy superfluidity. That is, imagine that I have a current flowing on the edge of this, on this square here. If this edge is crossed by a vortex pair, this doesn't change anything to the value of the current. The total vorticity inside the square is unchanged. But when you increase the temperature, the average distance between the two members of the pairs increases. And finally, this average distance between the two members of the pairs, plus vortex and minus vortex, diverges when the temperature reaches the critical temperature Tc. And above Tc, now you have a plasma of vortices. The positive vortices and the negative vortices live their own life. And now you cannot have anymore a current flowing on the edge here because this current will be crossed randomly by positive vortices and negative vortices. Each time it is crossed by a positive vortex, it increases by 1 unit of quantum of circulation of the velocity. When it's a negative vortex, it decreases. So the current undergoes a Brownian motion and rapidly dumps to 0. So what really kills the superfluidity is the fact that you should not have any free vortices, and this is precisely what happens at Tc. So this theory of Kosterlitz and Thouless arrived in 72, 73, and it was tested a few years later in 78 with a superfluid liquid-ion film, but it was a very hard experiment, and only a very specific experiment of the theory could be tested in the experiment. So cold atoms later arrived and could address many features of the BKT transition. So here I have just put a few. I mean, we did some experiments early in Paris, 15 years ago, by, again, interferometry. You have seen before that interferometry is a powerful tool. So now, for this experiment, we had two planes, and there could be some random vortices in the lower plane or in the upper plane who are making the interference between the two planes. And from the interferogram that we got here, we could make some statistics about the vortices that were present in the plane. Later on, vortices could be directly observed in the group of Yong-Il Shin in Seoul. So here, this is a disk-shaped condensate, flat condensate seen from above, as I discussed before. And here you could see directly the little holes here that are present. And if you look carefully, you may even say that these holes are grouped by pairs, like this pair here, or maybe this one, or this one. So it's close to what you expect from BKT theory. This was really not possible to observe in a film of helium liquid because there the size of the vortex is much too small to be seen by optical means. So many groups have contributed to that. I'm not going to discuss all of them. Let me simply emphasize one aspect, which is direct test of superfluidity, which is interesting. Again, it illustrates what we can do with these atomic gases. So a possible definition of superfluidity is the following. It was proposed by Landau. It's that you take an impurity, a defect in the system, and you move the defect at a constant velocity in the sample, and you look whether this motion of the defect deposits some heat in the system. That's the temperature changes when you move a defect inside the gas or the fluid. So this is what we did in Paris in 2012. Oops, let me go back to the pointer. 2012, and the experiment was done again in Hamburg with a different system, a gas of molecules. And the results are the same, so I will show here the latest results of the Hamburg group. The defect that you move in this experiment is not a material defect. It is the hole created by a laser beam. So you focus a laser beam onto your gas. You focus it as much as you can, so a spot on the order of 1 micrometer, the wavelength of light. You do this with a good microscope objective. And with some deflectors, you move this little hole created by the laser inside the sample. And you measure the temperature before and after. Again, this is a destructive measurement, so you have to do the experiment several times if you want to get a good precision. And so what you get is exactly in agreement with what you could think of superfluidity. That is, first, if you have not a superfluid system, so if you are above the critical temperature, essentially when you plot the temperature increase here resulting from this motion of the impurity as a function of the velocity of the object, you find that even the smallest velocity creates some heat in the sample, so the system is not superfluid. Whereas when you cool the system below the critical temperature, you have a whole range of velocities between 0 and 4 millimeters per second here, where essentially the system does not heat in spite of the fact that you are moving something inside it. Here the scale is arbitrary unit, but I mean, this is what they've chosen to do in the Henning-Moritz group, but the typical scale here is 10 nanokelvin. So the experiment started, say, at 30 or 40 nanokelvin, and you could see an increase from 30 to 50 nanokelvin. And so you have a whole range, as I said, of velocities which do not hit the sample, which means that indeed you have a superfluid system. And when you reach a critical velocity, then the superfluidity breaks, and then you start to hit the sample again. And the value of the critical velocity here is now well understood. We worked on this, by making some classical field simulation. Essentially, what creates the dissipation is the fact that in the wake of this impurity here, you can create some vortices, pairs of positive and negative vortices, a bit like if you move your finger into a bucket of water, you can see some vortices behind your finger. So this is what creates the dissipation. So this velocity here is lower than the speed of sound. The main mechanism is not the creation of phonons, which would correspond to the speed of sound, but the creation of vortices, which lower the critical velocity. But this is, I would say, well under control. So again, I don't want to expand too much about BKT physics, but to say in a few words, many things have been studied on this system. The equation of state has been studied, the quasi-long-range order. In fact, it's not true long-range order because of Mermin-Wagner theorem, but quasi-long-range, this algebraic decay. The sound has been seen, first and second sound. There is a nice experiment which was published a few months ago by the Cambridge group on this. The critical velocity was measured, the scale invariance, and so on. And as I said, there is an excellent agreement between experimental results and theoretical prediction. So it's really a nice validation of the Kosterlitz-Sarles theory applied to these 2D superfluid systems. Okay, so I go to the last illustration of this talk, which is topology. So here now I would like to discuss something which is in relation with the quantum Hall effect. It will still be two-dimensional physics, but just to illustrate the various tools that we have, the two dimension now will not be simply x and y as before, but it will be x as before, but the y direction will be synthetic. It will be an artificial dimension, if you want, which means that if we really want to use also y and z, the real y and z, we can make a 4-dimensional system because we have the 3 real dimensions of space plus this artificial dimension that you will see in a moment. But for the moment, we don't care about y and z, so we work only with x plus some artificial dimension, so we have a 2D system. And this experiment was done, was the PhD thesis of Thomas Chalopin, and the PI on this experiment is Sylvain Assimben, together with Rafael Lopez. Okay, so first, let me, some advertisement for a review paper that we wrote. I mean, there is a lot of activity on topology and atomic or photonic systems. So I'm not going to give references to everyone here because otherwise it would fill my transparencies. But there are 2 reviews of modern physics paper which were published 2 years ago. One that I wrote together with Nigel Cooper and Jan Spielmann on atoms. And these are the one with 10 authors, Ozawa et al., which was written about photonic systems. So if you want to know more about topology in atomic or photonic systems, you can have a look at these reviews. Okay, so let me go to the quantum Hall effect here. And first of all, I would like to start with a reminder about what happens in the true quantum Hall effect. That is what happens when you put charged particles in a magnetic field, both classically and quantum mechanically. So classically, if my particles move in the xy plane, say, and if I have a magnetic field perpendicular to this plane, we all know what happens. We have cyclotron orbits at a frequency, omega c, cyclotron frequency, which is simply QB over m. And this orbit can be placed can be put at any place in the plane. We always get the same frequency. Now, if you turn to a quantum description of the particle, this is a textbook thing also. What you find are equidistant energy level separated by an energy h bar omega c. So it's a nice connection between classical physics and quantum physics. Omega c, the cyclotron frequency, QB over m, shows up in the 2 problems. Each level, which is called a Landau level, is macroscopically degenerate. By macroscopic degenerate, I mean the number of states that I have here increases linearly with the area of the system. And this macroscopic degeneracy that you have here is simply the quantum counterpart of the fact that here I could place the orbit at any place in the plane, and I got the same result. So the quantum degeneracy here is just a quantum transcription of this homogeneity of the plane. And now what is known is that these bands are topological in the sense that if I look, for example, for integer quantum Hall effect, if I fill this lower Landau level here with particles and nothing elsewhere, I will have a quantized conductivity associated with this gas of electrons filling the lowest Landau level. I will have edge states, that is, I will have some particular motion of the electrons which travel along the edge of my sample. If the sample is on this table, this edge state will travel clockwise, if the magnetic field is like this, on the table, and so on. So these are the signature of topology, which is directly rooted in the Landau levels. So can we make Landau levels for our atoms? Our atoms have no charge, of course. We do not have ions, so we cannot rely on the Lorentz force QV cross B because Q is 0. So we have to find something else. So as I said, the something else first is a new space. The space that we are going to use is a tensor product between one real dimension of space, let's call it X, this is this one, and a synthetic dimension, which is simply the spin of my atoms. And here we are doing an experiment with an atom which has a spin 8, J equal 8. This atom is dysprosium. I don't know whether you have heard about dysprosium. Personally, I had not heard about dysprosium 10 years ago, but now I start to know better about dysprosium. So this atom is dysprosium, and dysprosium has an angular momentum in its ground state, J equal 8, which means 17 Zeeman substates. Okay? So I have drawn here 17 lines, parallel lines along X, and so this dimension here is simply the spin projection along a given quantization axis. And this is the playground in which we are going to work. So we have a continuous motion along the real dimension x, and we have a discretized motion, discretized space, if you want, in the synthetic dimension. And we have sharp edges, which is nice if we want to look for edge states, which come with quantum Hall state, because when you are at -8, there is no way to go to -9. -9 does not exist. And here, if you are at +8, you cannot go to +9. +9 does not exist. So we have sharp edges here. And the motion along this synthetic dimension is created by laser light. That is, we shine a pair of laser beams along the x direction, K1 and K2, and this laser beam, K1 and K2, induces Raman transition. What I mean by that is that if I start in state -8, for example, I can absorb a photon K1, make a stimulated emission in K2, and the polarization of K1 and K2 are chosen such that I transfer +1 unit of angular momentum. Therefore, I go from -8 to -7. And I also choose the frequency correct to be sure that this happens. Then I can go from -8 to -7 to -6, and so on. So I have a nearest neighbor hopping, which is possible thanks to these two Raman beams. Okay? So now I have a motion which is possible both along x, this is the usual motion, and along y, synthetic y, thanks to this Raman transition. Note that actually, because of the fact that K1 and K2 are co-propagating, each time I have a Raman transition like this, the atom gains h bar K1 by absorbing K1, and it loses h bar K2 because it makes a stimulated emission in K2. So actually, the momentum of the atom changed by, in absolute value, K1 plus K2, which is typically 2 h bar K, because K1 and K2 are in modulus very small, very close, so very close. Therefore, there is a spin-orbit coupling. A motion along y, jumping from -8 to -7, is associated with a change of the momentum along x. So we want to make Landau levels out of that. So we want to make a flat band to simulate the macroscopic degeneracy of the Landau levels, lowest Landau level, say. And we want to make this band topological. So let's first look why it is flat. So we have, to start with, our atom, which can be in any of the 17 states of the spin, GM, and state P along X is coupled, well, P for m equals 0, say, will be coupled to P minus h bar k for m equal +1, or P minus h bar k for m equal -1. So I have a family of states, GM, P minus m h bar k, which are all coupled together by this Raman transition. This is what I just discussed before. So the Hamiltonian can be written P square over 2m minus h bar gamma omega over 2, omega being the strength of the Raman transition, G plus e to the I kx, so I jump from m to m plus 1 and I gain momentum h bar k, or G minus e minus kx, just the reverse process. When omega is 0 here, so if I forget about this part of the Hamiltonian, I just have P square over 2m, parabolic dispersion relation. So I have 17 parabolas which are placed like that as a function of the momentum. And now I switch on the coupling, and the coupling will, for example, couple the parabola for -8 and the parabola for -7. So what is a crossing that I have here will become an avoided crossing, as usual in quantum mechanics. So I have to do this at every place, diagonalize a 17 by 17 matrix, and this is what we get. If we choose correctly the coupling, we can get something which is indeed nearly flat for a large range of momenta between -8 and +8. And I pretend that this is nothing but the equivalent of the lowest Landau level. And this state here is the second Landau level, first excited Landau level, and so on. When I go high, it becomes worse and worse, but if I have 2 Landau levels, that's enough for me being happy, so we can stick with that. So they are flat, so they are eligible as Landau levels, at least these two. Are they topological? The answer is yes. And in order to see that, the best way is to think of what it means to have a magnetic field in quantum mechanics. You can think of a Lorentz force, but this is not, as I said, since our charge is 0, it's maybe not the best way. But you should think more in terms of Aharonov-Bohm effect. Aharonov-Bohm effect is really a signature of magnetism in quantum mechanics. In the sense that if you take a charged particle in a magnetic field, So again, the magnetic field is perpendicular to the board, and I take a charged particle. If I move this charged particle on a trajectory, on a closed trajectory like this, when I have closed my trajectory, the particle has accumulated a phase which is proportional to the flux of the magnetic field perpendicular, or in the, the flux of the magnetic field across the surface that is delimited by the trajectory. Magnetic field being perpendicular to this surface. So this is really a signature of magnetism, a geometric phase proportional to the area enclosed by a trajectory. And here we are in a situation where we have exactly the same thing. And it's relatively simple to understand. Let's suppose that I have an atom which starts, say, at this position here, so again, in spin state M. And first, it starts by making a Raman transition from M to M+1 at a given place X. So when it does that, it gains the phase of the laser, which is e to the ikx for x equal xa here. Now the atom moves freely along this line, no change of phase. Then I suppose that the atom here comes back from M+1 to M to make a closed trajectory. And here it will lose the phase of the laser, but now it's not e to the ikx8, it's ikxb, because it's not the same value of x. So here it gains e to the ikxa, now it loses e to the ikxb. And then back here, so the change of phase on this closed trajectory is e to the ikxa minus xb. So I have indeed a phase which is accumulated, a geometric phase, which is proportional to the area of the trajectory. The larger the distance between xa and xb, the larger the phase. So this is a system where, even if I don't have a true Lorentz force built in, I have a Aronoff-Bohm phase, and therefore I know that there will be some magnetism, some topology associated with the Landau levels. So I can describe in 2 slides what we get. What we do typically is to prepare the atom in a state which is easy to prepare, say state -8 somewhere here. And then by a combination of changing the detuning of the lasers, applying forces to the atoms, I don't want to enter in the detail, we can bring the atom anywhere onto this flat state here. And when the atom is here, we measure its state. And we have to measure the state both along the real dimension. For this, we do simply a time of flight, and we measure what is the velocity of the atom by seeing how much it travels during a given time of flight. And in order to measure the spin state of the atom, again, basic quantum mechanics, we have to do a Stern-Gerlach experiment to measure the value of the projection of the spin along a given quantization axis. But usually in a quantum mechanics textbooks, you have 2 values of the projection of the spin for the silver atom of Mr. Stern and Mr. Gerlach. Here we have 17 possible states. So it's a Stern-Gerlach experiment with 17 possible spots. And this is indeed what we see. We see spots between +8 and -8. So if we stop somewhere here, for example, this I think corresponds to the green point. So essentially we see 4 well-populated spots, which are m equals 0, +1, +2, +3 here. And you see that the velocity, the average velocity is typically 0 here. If we stop earlier, somewhere here, we'll get this value, this thing here with m equal -4, -3, -2, -1, and again, an average velocity 0. And the fact that the average velocity is 0 is nice because it's a direct illustration of the fact that the band is flat. Use my microphone. Indeed, again, a well-known result of quantum mechanics, the group velocity, Vg, is simply the derivative of the energy with respect to the momentum. So saying that the average velocity is 0 means that for all these states that we have prepared, by stopping here, 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 we got a derivative of d over dp, which was 0, which is nothing but a flat band. So this is a direct illustration of a flat band. Now, can we see some features related to the quantum Hall effect or to motion of electrons in the magnetic field? Can we see cyclotron orbits? The answer is yes. For this, we prepare simply an atom at a given momentum p, and then we give a small kick to stay not in the lowest Landau level, but to populate slightly the next Landau level, and we monitor, we make a movie of what happens to the atom. And you see nice cyclotron orbit when you are in the bulk of the material means being far from the state, spin state -8 and +8. So here you see nice cyclotron orbit. And now if your atoms is prepared more on the edge of the sample, you see the skipping orbit I was mentioning before. That is an atom on the upper state here will go like this, always to the right. An atom on the bottom line here, close to -8, will go always to the left. So you have here a direct illustration of the chirality, which is behind this realization of quantum Hall effect. And last thing, we can check that we have a quantized Hall conductance. A Hall conductance means that if you apply a potential across a Hall bar, potential Vy, you have a current Ix, and this conductivity sigma xy, which relates the voltage along y and the current along x, is quantized. This is a signature of quantum Hall effect. And here we do the same thing. We apply the equivalent of a voltage, that is a difference between spin +8 and -8. It can be just a magnetic field. And we see indeed a current along x, which is quantized here at the expected value. So we have here a nice illustration of a quantum Hall bar with all the phenomenology of quantum Hall effect. I think I'm at the end now. So the main message here is that with the three illustrations that I've chosen, the ring, the superfluidity, and the quantum Hall effect, the main message is that cold atomic gases offer many knobs to explore quantum matter. So if you have any idea of an experiment that would be nice to be done with quantum matter, you could ask yourself whether it can be realized with atomic gases, because we have many knobs. We can control the interactions, we can control the dimension of space, this you have seen, we can control topology, we can control the energy landscape. I didn't discuss that, but we can make, with the standing wave of laser, we can make optical lattices, which is a very lively topic in our field. And so, I mean, we have many knobs. And we have also many challenges. To just quote one in direct relation with what I discussed, one important challenge relates with what I discussed last here, the quantum Hall effect. Integer quantum Hall effect that I discussed here is something which is achieved for independent particles. You neglect interaction between particles. But if you now take into account the interactions between the particles, you can achieve much more complex states, which are related to fractional quantum Hall state. If we could achieve that with cold atoms, that would be really a nice achievement, because then the phenomenology of quantum matter becomes very, very rich. So with this, I think I will stop. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean, for these beautiful insights into the quantum world, and in particular also the connections of the condensed matter and the quantum world. So the talk is open for discussion. Who wants to start?
Okay, thank you very much. The question is just, you said at the very beginning about the vortices, you said that you relax from the first stage, which is 3 random angles, phases, and you relax to 1 phase,
yes.
A single phase. And you say it's a relaxation. But apparently, the first state has a higher entropy than the final one. So the question is, what means relaxation, or what means out of equilibrium here?
So when you do an experiment like that, the system, as I say, is closed. And so I would say the entropy goes into phonons, essentially. So you have, in other words, when you look at these lines, they are not perfectly straight. You have some wigglings, which correspond to local phase defects. So you have a global phase winding, which is for this. You have a global phase winding, which is here is -1, plus plenty of little phonons, which correspond to the wiggling of the line. So the energy goes into these phonons. And this is why we have to wait for a certain time. this is why I mentioned the speed of sound. The time it takes for the phonons to travel, interact together to reach a thermal equilibrium. So your question about the entropy, or I think, goes into the phonon bath, plus some global phase winding, but the global phase winding is more the result of a minimization of a kind of macroscopic kinetic energy.
Further questions? Cool. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. What is the net benefit of using a synthetic dimension in this case? Couldn't you use the two spatial dimensions in your experiment? And there's a second question, actually, which may be related, is can you comment on perspective of physics in 4 dimensions?
Yes, so I start with the first one. In 4D, indeed, there is a 4D quantum Hall effect, which has been studied a lot theoretically. I know that Sylvain has some plans to study that. I'm not a specialist of 4D quantum Hall effect, but I know that you have 2 Chern numbers to characterize and not a single one. And there is possibility to study that. Now, back to the first question, what is the advantage? It's quite hard to have a magnetic field as large with a true system. That is, one way that you know well is to make an optical lattice, say a square optical lattice, and achieve a flux on the order of pi per cell of the lattice, which would correspond to what we have here. But in order to do that, so far people had to shake the lattice, go to time-dependent problems. You have some heating which comes with that. I mean, Emmanuel Bloch did. Monica Edelsberger, which I mentioned, which was postdoc with us, made her thesis PhD thesis on that. You have some heating which come with that, so I'm not sure it's a direct route to, say, fractional quantum Hall effect. Also here, the advantage is that we have these sharp edges, and if we want to look for edge state, you cannot imagine better than a spin, because you know that the spin will not go over the value of J that you are dealing with. So since we have here a large J, we have a discrete system, but relatively large. We could see cyclotron orbits, for example, because so the radius of the orbit is small compared to 17 in reduced units. So I think there is no disadvantage and many advantages for this. What
about rotating the gas?
Rotating is nice, but yes. Yes, we tried. We saw plenty of vortices, but never a nice vortex lattice in this system, contrary to what we did 20 years ago with a free 3D gas. So rotating the gas is nice, but I think the flux per atom is larger in this experiment. So if we want, again, the fractional quantum Hall effect is reached when you have essentially 1 quantum of flux per atom, and I think this is more promising. Yes?
What do you need to change in your experiment to see the fractional quantum Hall effect? And how would you see it? What would you observe in the same kind of measurements?
So for the moment, I would say we don't have enough interactions. So we need to have enough interactions, increase the density to reach what I was just saying, that is typically 1 flux quantum per particle. So we are working on it. The problem with dysprosium here is that the interactions are very complicated. This comes with a large magnetic moment, and with the large kinetic moment, large spin. And so we have to learn more about the interactions in this system. On the paper, not much is missing, but in the lab it's a bit more challenging. But yes, on the paper, when you do the algebra, it works well. I mean, it's with bosons, so the Laughlin wave function will not be 1/3, but will be 1/2. But this is not a big change. You need to respect symmetrization and not anti-symmetrization, but that's okay. Pfaffian is not also 5/2, but it's union factor 1. But this is well understood. So it's just a matter of having enough particles, keeping 1 flux quantum per particle.
But you will see the same kind of orbits?
Yes. So the question is what we observe. So in principle, you have a many-body gap, you have an incompressible state. So I would say the first hint will be a signature of incompressibility. And the many-body gap, if we have enough interactions, is sizable. It's on the order of 10 nanokelvin, so it's on the order of the temperature of our system. So in principle, we should be able to see the gap protecting the fractional quantum Hall state, at least for the simplest one, the Laughlin wave function.
Yes, so thank you for the really impressive results. So my question, maybe you can expect it about this idea of quantum simulation. So you have a super well-controlled quantum system. You can control parameters, measure many things. You proudly said we have a perfect agreement between theory and experiment. And now the question about this quantum simulation idea is to push the experiment to a point where you can get in a controlled way results that are not calculable or beyond what can be currently calculated. So it might push theoreticians like Laurent to invent new methods, I don't know. But there is a real challenge of reaching this regime where the system can tell more than one theory can tell. So
yes.
Can you move in this direction? Or?
Yes, well, this was the last line. The fractional quantum Hall state is an example of that. That is, there are some states in the fractional quantum Hall effect which are understood, like Laughlin wave function, but there are also phases. I mentioned the filling factor 5.5, which I think is still very controversial. I mean, if you are specialists of fractional quantum Hall effect, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think this is still very controversial. And if we could achieve that with cold atoms, we would have probes which would be dramatically different from what you can do on a whole bar. So that would be really nice.
So if you reach this regime, will you believe your experiment, or will you ask theoreticians to make more effort, or what's the point on that?
Well, we will. I have not seen the results, so I cannot tell you that I will trust them. But in principle, if I find indeed that there is a gap if I do a spectrum of the system by Bragg spectroscopy and I see a gap, and I see that this gap varies with interaction strengths. Yes, I think I will trust the slope of the curve. Yes.
And it will be a challenge for theoreticians to get it.
Yes, yes. Well, it is already a challenge to understand some phases of fractional quantum Hall state. Yes, it is a big challenge because it's as soon as it's true for bosons or fermions. It cannot be solved easily with quantum Monte Carlo simulation because you have the sign problem or the phase problem in the presence of magnetic field. So you are limited to a few tens of particles, and it's not enough to discriminate between the various models, various proposals for this phase. I'm sure.
But of course, before the theoreticians work harder, they will ask you for the wave function.
Yes, yes. So again, interference experiments can give hints on the wave function, which is not the case for solid-state physics. It's hard to interfere two quantum Hall systems. Here, we may think of doing some interferences. So that would be. We can also create excitation. I mean, if I go back to the Laughlin wave function, which is the emblematic wave function of fractional quantum state, excitation are holes. Well, you have seen how we can create holes. I mean, when we studied superfluidity, we were creating holes. So, in principle, if I have what I believe to be a Laughlin state, I can put a laser here, another laser here, and rotate the two around each other and look at the phase I have accumulated. Is it pi or 2 pi? So I can address whether these are pi anyons or not, which is what is expected in this case. So I think realizing the state is very difficult. Then having new tools after that will not be, I think, the most challenging part, because these tools we already have. But realizing the state is not easy.
A quick question, speaking about tools, are there ideas about non-destructive measurement methods? Or
yes.
Is it still out of reach?
Actually, at the beginning of cold gases, there was a lot of activity on non-destructive measurement by looking not at the absorption of a laser beam, but say at the index of refraction. So in this case, you don't shine a resonant probe, but you shine an off-resonant probe, and you try to look at some index of refraction. So then you don't deposit any energy. But actually, it's always, in a sense, destructive. That is, you always perturb the system. There is no, Philippe is specialist of quantum non-evolution measurement. So you can non-demolish your system, but you always perturb it. And so in the end, people now more and more rely on destructive measurement, and then you need a reliable experiment to accumulate statistics over thousands of realizations. The typical time scale here is between 10 seconds and 1 minute. So you have a new sample, say, every minute. So if you run one experiment overnight, it's automatized. When you come back in the next morning, you have good statistics.
Okay, if there are no further... Oh, sorry.
I have a question about the measurements of the cyclotron orbits.
Yes.
How is it done in practice? Because I understand that you have to wait each point. Is it time of flight measurements?
Yes.
So you have to wait between each measurement. And,
so again, it's destructive. Huh? So in order to do that, each point here that you see, each point here that you, wait, no, it doesn't work. I cannot. Each point that you see here is the result of several measurements. So it's a movie that we did by accumulating various images. Okay, so each measurement is a time of flight with a Stern-Gerlach in the y direction. So we get a given measurement give you Vx and Vy, or x and y. Actually, we measure the velocity along x and we measure the position along y, but when you have the velocity, you can always infer the position. So we measure, say, x and y, and the given measurement is a given xy value. And so you do the same measurement several times for a given time, and then you go to the next time. So the cyclone period is 20 microseconds here. So typically, between every point, there is 1 microsecond delay.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
So if...
Yeah, about this figure and about the choice of a synthetic dimension,
yes.
Is there no price to pay for the fact that you have a discrete scale? I mean, because here it's amazing that the cyclotron orbit it's much smaller than 17, but it's not small. It's not larger than 1. Yes, not so much larger than 1, and yet it's a perfect circle. So
yes.
how
so the diameter of the cyclotron orbit, you choose it. You choose it by the amount by which you excite the next Landau level. What is fixed is the period of the orbit. It's always QB over M, but the size of the orbit is just the contamination of the wave function by the next Landau level, so which we have excited so that we got the good size for the orbit. The price to pay, there are several prices to pay. We were discussing about interactions before. The interactions become non-local along the synthetic dimension because all the atoms are at the same place, actually here, in the same place in space. They have different spin orientation, but if I go back to this image, for example, all these atoms here, the atom -8, -7, +8, +7, up to -8, they are at the same position in real space. So they all interact together. So the interaction in this direction are long range, whereas on this direction they are short range, because an atom here does not interact with an atom which is far apart. So it complicates the situation. So we have to find a way to make the interaction a bit local in this direction, maybe by making a small shift between the various lines by a gradient of magnetic field. So we are thinking about that. Or maybe we can work with long-range interaction in one direction and short-range in the other. But this is one price to pay, among others.
Okay, so if there are no further urgent questions, then let us thank warmly Jean again.
There is there is no cocktail afterwards. So
exactly. So the good news is there's no cocktail, so we can use the cocktail time for the rest.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to bother everyone. You mentioned the Kibble-Zurek experiment. Yes. I was curious about what you did exactly and how does this experiment compare with other like Kibble-Zurek tests, for example, with Rydberg atom arrays?
With Rydberg atom arrays, I don't know. We did some real Kibble-Zurek experiment before that one. So in that experiment, we were really starting with a ring and cooling it, quench cooling it from non-condensed to condensed system. We did also with a square. And from that, we could extract some critical exponent, typically the dynamical exponent z, which is not so well known. And the value we found was in good agreement with mean field theory, actually. In 2D, it's a bit subtle, Kibble-Zurek. Laetitia Cuyandolo has worked on that a lot. It's not clear that you always have critical exponent very precisely, because you have some logarithmic correction. 2D is full of logarithm. So we have some logarithmic correction to the scaling laws that you expect in 3D. For the experiment I showed here, it's hard to extract a critical exponent. We have some time scale that we can get, but not because here the number of patches is fixed by us. It's not a variable that the system chooses freely. So it's a part of Kibble-Zurek that we can extract from this, but not the part dealing with critical exponent.
Okay, let's thank Jean warmly again.
Thank you very much.